Hi, my name's Kara-Leah from the Yoga Lunchbox, and today I have with me Jay Brown. Jay Brown is from the States. He is a writer, a yoga teacher, and creator of Jay Brown's Yoga DVD. And he has a liking for publishing provocative articles in the world of yoga. And this is why I've asked Jay if you wanted to come and talk to us. So welcome, Jay.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. You'll have to forgive me. I'm in my basement because my wife and daughter are sleeping upstairs. So I can speak at a normal volume down here. So forgive me the background.
Perfect. We can see you, and that's what matters.
Cool.
Just a little bit of background about your yoga history, because it's interesting and it informs, I guess, your viewpoint now. You started with Ashtanga yoga, is that right?
Yeah, I started practicing back in the early 90s. In fact, the first place I practiced was at the Jivamukti Yoga Center on 2nd Avenue. And I started there and then sort of quickly got into a more formal Ashtanga Vinyasa practice and did that for a little while. I did eventually injure myself working on some third series poses. And after that happened, when you ask your teachers about your injuries, they always say alignment. So I set about really trying to learn Iyengar alignment principles after that, which I did for some while as well. And ultimately I did have better alignment, but I still had a bunch of injuries and was not always doing so well. And eventually I did find my way to what I teach now, which is rooted in the Desikachar Krishnamacharya tradition. And that's really where I was able to find the yoga that was working for me.
It says on your bio that your primary teacher, I guess, is Mark Whitwell. Is that correct? You've worked with Mark?
Yes, he's probably my most influential teacher. My other big influence was a woman named Allison West, who teaches here in New York City still. I learned several different approaches through her. She's quite well trained in a number of different styles. But later on, when I really made the shift to sort of a more therapeutic orientation, and when I really figured out what I needed, I would say that Mark was really the teacher who helped me figure that out.
You know he's a New Zealander, right?
Yeah, I do. I do know that.
We've had it on the website.
Close friends now. We've been friends for many years now, and in fact, we've taught side by side. And I do represent his teaching sons in Japan these days, and as a heart of yoga teacher. And I think Mark, more than anyone I know, teaches a context for yoga practice that is really important. I don't know anyone who teaches it quite like he does, and it's been the real difference to me,
Yeah. So how would you describe that to someone? Like when you talk about the shift in yoga practice from Ashtanga through Iyengar and then now towards the way that you practice, what's the fundamental underlying difference in the approach there?
Well, I would answer that question differently depending on who I was speaking to.
Okay. So let's say our audience are people that probably do a bit of yoga and have some knowledge, I imagine, the Yoga Lunchbox audience, and they might have tried quite a few different kinds of yoga as well. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, if somebody has studied like yoga philosophy, then I would use some of those terms, and I would say that the difference is between like a non-dual framework for practice and a dualistic framework for practice. Is Purusha and Prakriti the same principle or two separate principles? And I think if I was speaking to folks who aren't necessarily coming from a more like intellectual or analytical standpoint, I would talk about it differently. I would talk about how many approaches in yoga practice, it's very much about like your physical edge. So here's your physical edge, and then I'm going to go a little bit past my physical edge. And if I don't do that, I'm not going to get anywhere. And if you're not seeing if you can go a little bit farther, then that would sort of be considered lazy or resistant sometimes. And I think that there's a mentality behind that, which you could also just call no pain, no gain if you wanted to. And that mentality is really effective for lots of things. Like if you want to run marathons or climb mountains, or you want to do certain types of yoga practice, you're going to absolutely need that mentality. But the practice that I do now does not subscribe to that at all. Mm-hmm. It's not about seeing if I can take my body farther past its physical edge. That's not the discipline. The discipline is, how am I today, and what's the right amount of work to do for that? Mm. And then on the day that I feel good, doing more is wonderful, feels great, and I get all these benefits. There's no injuries. Mm-hmm. But on days I'm not doing so great, I have to really honor that. I can't just ignore it and say, screw it, and just go ahead and power through, which I did for years. Mm. Because if I do that, while there's sometimes like an immediate gratification, like an immediate benefit, like a purge that happens, yeah. There's always like a backlash that happens. It doesn't actually make me feel better. Like, it ends up depleting me, or I got injured, or a lot of times you just feel like you suck while you're doing it,
Yeah. But there's that discipline, right?
So lastly, I'll finish by saying that the idea is that the discipline is not just to do as much as you can every time, no matter what, or you're lazy. The discipline is to just do the right amount for how I am today. And that's not always really clear. Mm-hmm. But like the inquiry to see if I can know that today is the challenge of my practice, rather than, can I take my body a little farther?
Mm-hmm. So that gets a little problematic if you're subscribing to, say, Ashtanga, and you're trying to do this 5 or 6 days a week, 90-minute practice, regardless of what's going on in your life.
Yeah, it is. It's a very arbitrary system. And there's certain elements that I've taken, like, I have like a set program that I do pretty much. Mm-hmm. It's in my video. That's my set program. Like, Ashtanga has set programs that you do every day. And I like that. I like the idea of sort of doing the same poses in the same order every day, because it's not the same every day. Like, there's all these different things happening in me, and I can observe those subtleties and shifts and sometimes shape them because of them. So there's certain aspects to that I really like. I just think that set system of forms is not always appropriate for every person, especially when you get later on in your years, because it's a pretty rigorous set of forms. And depending on your teacher, like, I think there's plenty of teachers out there who go ahead and like allow the forms to change and modify for people, and some people who don't, that are like more strict. But if you try to stay strict, I do think that you end up with issues. It's just what I was doing in my early 20s, I cannot do in my early 40s and receive the same benefit. Doesn't make sense.
So is this where your video arose from, your DVD?
The video arose because I've been teaching these programs for like over 10 years, and then I've been using them to train teachers. It's just like a toolbox of technique, I don't expect the teachers to stick to it. Some do, some use parts of it. It's just meant to be sort of a toolbox that you could use. A yoga toolbox, right?
Perfect.
And so, I had a buddy of mine who came to a workshop at Kripalu, who also dabbles in like independent video and music production. And he said, "Hey man, I want to get what you look like when you're doing it." It's like, he saw me doing some demonstrations, and he was like, "I want to see what it looks like when you do it." And so I had it in mind that we were just document it. We're just going to document the forms, And when we did it, I wrote about it. We had this kind of experience together of shooting it.
Mm-hmm. I remember the article.
And ultimately, when we got into doing like editing and stuff, he was like, I can practice to this. He's like, I'm going to make a practice tape for myself out of this.
Right.
And it kind of just snowballed, where I was like, well, maybe people could use this. And then we had to come up with like audio lead tracks, which was kind of dumb. If we were smart, we would have recorded those audio tracks first, and then I would have just done it to the audio tracks. But we had to spend a whole bunch of time in a room with a booth with me talking into a microphone. But what we then discovered was, well, how much of that do you want? Like, how much of me talking again and again and again do you want? So we made 2 different audio tracks for each one. So one of them has more teaching, And then if you've heard that a bunch of times and you want to turn me off, you can turn me off and have less of me talking.
Mm-hmm.
So I still think that there's some flaws. I mean, there's flaws with DVDs in general, but I've certainly been really happy. Like we sold over 1,000 of them in 9 months, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And they're all over the world. Like people in like Croatia and Turkey, like random places on the planet. And I get some really great emails. So for me, it's been very rewarding, just to sort of see if what I'm doing could be helpful to other people who aren't here where I live in my own little circle,
Now you've called it Jay Brown's Yoga DVD, right? Like that's the official name?
Yeah, honestly, we went through all these different things about like coming up with titles and names, and we just decided that if there's a brand, there isn't a brand. It's just, I'm this guy, I'm a yoga teacher, and if you come to the yoga center that I own in Brooklyn, you know what I mean? And we also feel like DVDs are kind of like they're going to be dead soon. Mm-hmm. There's going to be no more DVDs soon. So we kind of made it as like a throwback to the old technology in a way, And so we just, I don't know, in the end, it's just Jay Brown's Yoga DVD. We wanted to like have it be, we didn't want to come up with a name and kind of gloss it up at all.
Every time I write about your DVD on the Yoga Lunchbox, which I do occasionally, I go to call it Gentle is the New Advanced. Like I have it in my head that is the name of your DVD. And then I double check, right? Accuracy. And
we considered calling it that because there was a lot of response to that title that I wrote for one of my blog posts. But the reason I didn't like that is that Gentle is the New Advance is a reactionary thing. Like it's a reaction to an idea that advanced means pushing your body. Mm-hmm. I didn't want the DVD to be, I don't know, I didn't want it to be that didn't feel like the right title. I wanted it to just exist as this weird nebulous thing, this not typical thing,
So then how would you, if you could possibly sum up the state of yoga in the West today, like where is it?
I mean, I just think that it's a really big crossroads. It's like a really a big time of reformation. I mean, because all the big established conventions have sort of broken apart. I mean, when I was coming up, I remember thinking, wow, look at what John Friend has done. And it was like this model of like what was possible for yoga teachers. When I was like in my early 20s and first starting to teach, it was like, wow, you could make like millions of dollars and like have a whole huge thing that you create, and then you're in Yoga Journal magazine right next to BKS Iyengar with your school of yoga, It was like this whole thing. And what's happened is all that stuff's fall. Even the big lineage holders, even in my own tradition, Deskachar, is not really with us, even though he's still alive, and his son, terrible tragedy that it is. So it's almost like it's just it's a wild, wild west, really. Mm-hmm. And also I think that there was a huge economic boom of it, like in the 90s. I remember one year, like I was getting calls for private yoga teachers. Like it was in Vogue magazine, like 10 cool, hippest thing of the year was to have a private yoga teacher. And, I sort of watched it, had this big like 90s power yoga boom craze. And then the economy kind of got all messed up, right? Mm-hmm. And then now it's been this sort of slow recovery out of it. So it's not a boom time like it was, at least for yoga teachers. Mm-hmm. There's people making money off yoga, but it's not yoga teachers. So
what about what's being taught? Like when you look around at what's being taught, do you think that's changed much, or is it changing, or is there a need for it to change? What are we teaching in classes?
I think, I don't know what other people are teaching in classes. I can only really speak to what I teach. But I do see what I think is a big sort of shifting and changing. And other people are writing about this, like Carol Horton's written about this as well. that I just know, for one, like, even if I think back to the early days, if I was at a party and I said I'm a yoga teacher, the question would always be, what's that? It's yoga.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm at a party and I say I'm a yoga teacher, they always say, well, what kind of yoga do you teach?
Yeah.
You know, like, people are way more savvy, and people have been doing yoga classes for like 10 to 20 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's got older, and everybody's matured some and have learned a thing or two through practice. Practice teaches, you know? Mm-hmm. And people tend to arrive at stuff, and I feel like now, like, people come in to the center knowing what it is. Like, back in the day, like, I purposely did not have vinyasa or advanced or hot anywhere on any of my promotional materials, you know? Mm-hmm. But nowadays, I really think that people, I don't know, they've done yoga for a long time, like I said, and they love it, but sometimes the classes that they were doing before, they're hurting them.
Yeah.
And they still love yoga, and they still know there's something there for them that they need to continue with. Mm-hmm. But there's something amiss, and they're looking for new information. And that's why I think in the last few years, people have responded to what I write about more. I mean, I've been writing this stuff for like a long time, you know, maybe 7, 8 years.
Yeah.
But like in the last 3 or 4 years, people, even in the early years, I would get a lot of people who were like, you're a hater, you know? Yeah. You know how when the blogs were really booming, and you'd have these long comment threads, and people would just go off on me. They would be like, what are you hater. And then nowadays, more people are like, thank you for writing this. And, you know,
like
I'm singing the same song I've always been singing. Now there's a lot more people singing it with me, is what I'm saying.
Because you wrote an article like 3 years ago called Screw Union with the Divine. Which, you know, it's kind of typical of what you write, isn't it, in a way?
Well, that was an early one that I feel when I first started figuring out what the blog writing was for me. And it was really because I got a thing from Yoga Journal that was like, I was like, what the, you know, you get that thing from Yoga Journal sometimes, and you're like, what is this? And I just kind of went off a little bit about how, you know, they were talking about union with the divine in this very like high art kind of way. And I was like dealing with all this real life stuff, you know, like paying bills and having a family. And I was like, and the concept of union with the divine that they were putting forth just felt like bull to me. It was like, that's not what my yoga is about. And so I wrote that post, and it got people really, that was one of the ones where I had a lot of people like,
yeah.
It's funny how much sometimes just like the controversial title for a blog post will really get everybody going, you know? Sometimes they don't even read the post. They just get that title, you know?
Because if they read it, they'd see you're actually saying the same thing in a way, but you're coming at it from a different angle. You know, you're saying that the divine is in the everyday small moments of life, right? And then
that's right.
And that's where we're sitting. So when you do your practice on a day-to-day basis, what is the purpose of your practice? Why are you bothering to show up to the mat?
Well, I think that practice for me is it's a way of kind of setting aside all the other things that I do with myself in my life, like kind of needing like the task of the daily stuff, mundane stuff, and just like participating intimately with the fact that I'm here.
Ooh, that's a great quote. Participating intimately with the fact that I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a way that is nurturing in sentiment and loving. You know, it's a nurturing, loving embrace. Yeah. And I am healed and renewed through that. And sometimes when I go to give myself that healing, loving embrace, it feels easy, and sometimes it doesn't feel so easy. Sometimes there's obstacles in the way of really getting myself to the embrace, you know, like it. But that's what it is. That's the process.
Now that helps me to make sense of a different article that you wrote. I forget the title, but in it you looked at the 3 sensibilities that shape our yoga process. So I want to talk about these 3 because I think it's important that, you know, when we go and do yoga, we don't often necessarily think about sort of the underlying philosophy that encompasses what we're doing, and this is what you're speaking about. So those three are transcendental, transformational, and sacrosantual. Is that how you pronounce it?
Sacrosanct. Yes.
Right.
Sacrosanct is a word meaning just as it is, you know.
Yeah. So when I read through those, I reckon when I first started yoga, I was all about transcending. I wanted to get the hell out of here because I was escaping. And then I shifted into the transformational, you know, let's take something out of this and make it something awesome, man. And now I find that I'm in that, oh, it's just so nice to be here. This is amazing. Sort of this sacrosantual place. So I found your description really interesting. So let's talk about them one by one. If you were to define for other people, what does transcendental mean? How does that approach look like to yoga?
Well, I mentioned earlier how there are technical terms, and that particular piece that you're referencing is my way of, is in the most layman's terms as I could put it. And it's still pretty high language. It's not, you know what I mean? These are hard concepts to try to like nail down. But without using the technical terms, I wanted to try to call them something that might make more sense. But in the technical terms, you could find this in sort of like Vedanta. You'd have, you know, non-dual, qualified non-dual, and dual. So transcendental would be dual. It means that the purpose of the practice is to transcend this suffering of world of suffering, time and space, you know, to get beyond it. And when people talk about liberation or enlightenment, a lot of times, you know, there's an implication. It means that you need to get liberated from where you are. It means that the Prakriti is here and the Purusha is over there. And then you got to do something or make something happen to get from here to there, you know, to transcend the distance between them. Yeah. Even sometimes when they talk about yoga as union, I don't even like that so much because it makes it sound like it's separate and then it has to be brought together or something. Okay. But really, transcendental means that it's a way of transcending the difficulties of life. Yeah. You use practice to see if you can get beyond it, like in your consciousness, you know? So
it's not that different from getting drunk because you just got fired. You know?
Yes, you could look at it that way. You know, I mean, I think that when I first came to yoga, maybe like you, I really felt like there was something wrong with me. I felt that there was something wrong with life, and I really wanted to get away from it, you know? So the idea that you could do that you could accomplish something in your consciousness that would allow for that is very appealing. And you will torture your body to do it if you think it'll get you there. Yeah, you love with vigor and zeal, you'll do it, you know? Yeah.
Alrighty. So then transformational. So what classical term would you use for this one?
I would call that qualified non-dual.
Yeah.
And I learned about qualified non-dual as I became more non-dual because I started to get into these debates with people where we pretty much agreed on everything. Like a qualified non-dualist believes in kind of a oneness in a sense. Like it's not a dualistic transcending that you're supposed to have happening, you know? But you're still got to do something. You know, like there's still like a bit of qualification on it. Okay. You're still going to have to become more aware, or you're still going to have to transform into a better version of yourself. Now that version might already be in there. Like it's you. It's not something you're trying to accomplish outside of you, but you're still going to have to do something to make it happen or to bring it about. It's not already in place. There's still like some hoops you're going to have to jump through, and there's still generally a hierarchy where like some people are farther along than you.
So that kind of the whole self-help thing too, in a way. That whole sense of transforming yourself or getting rid of obstacles or becoming the better you or realizing your potential.
I think a lot of the self-help language is qualified non-dual. It's transformational. It's all about what you just said. Like, it's not. It's rooted in stuff that I totally agree with, like in many respects. And so you can sort of say, like, okay, that could be okay. But the way that it's spoken about and the semantics become really important. it still creates a bit of like separation, or there's still a hoop, there's still a qualification on it. It's not just already in place.
Okay.
You know?
You're not quite perfect as you are. You need to do this thing to become. To become it, even though it's already you. Okay. It's a bit of a paradox, you know, but it just, there's a bit of a hedge on it. Okay. So then the third one, and I'm going to keep saying this word so I can get it, sacrosantual.
That's correct.
Woohoo! All right, this one I'm really interested in because I've never seen this word before.
Long and hard for that word.
It's a good word. It's got everything going on. To me, I just go second chakra, man. Maybe that's a sacral thing, but yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us about it.
Sacrosantual is what I would call radical non-dual.
Okay.
And Mark Whitwell teaches from this place, and you could look at a man named U.G. Krishnamurti. He's a very radical non-dual guy.
Yep.
Where it just shattered the qualification on it. It just took it one little step farther to say, actually, there's nowhere you need to get to. And you don't even need to do it. It's like...
Yeah.
It's already in place, you know, and it really is already in place. And it is about relaxing into it more than bringing it about.
Okay. Oh, it's that whole surrender, letting go, like that thing we're so afraid of.
Yeah. And that the surrendering, that there's often some skillful means to help bring that about.
Okay.
And that skillful means to help bring it about is what practice is. Mm-hmm. But the practice isn't about transforming you into something or bringing out something that's dormant, like a Kundalini idea or something, you know, like. And it's not about trying to transcend. It's just intimate participation with what is.
Yeah. I've heard Mark say that before. Intimate participation with what is. That to me feels like a really, what's the word, pagan way of almost being, whereby it's just radical acceptance or celebration of what you already are. The fact that you are already amazing. And just being with that amazingness. Yeah. So how does that look? Like if we look at those three things then, so if you're practicing, like I'm doing Ashtanga right now, I'm not an Ashtanga yogi, but I happened to come across a really good Ashtanga teacher, so I started doing the practice. And it's difficult because there is always a sense of wanting to get somewhere or get better or whatever, and I'm struggling a little bit with that. My actual practice is more like just sit down and hang out with myself. And breathe, you know, and when I do that, sometimes I'll move and sometimes I won't, and you know, things will happen or they don't happen. And it's been interesting for me to go from that just hang out with the breath place to a formal practice, which sometimes feels like slightly violent in a way. You know, and I struggle with it. It's like, is this because I'm not disciplined or so I'm interested in this whole thing of
what I would say to that is, first of all, I did that very strong, structured practice like you're doing now when I was much younger, you know, like in my 20s. And when I first started practicing the way I practice now, I was practicing that way at home, but I was still teaching power vinyasa classes to pay my rent.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have even really thought of trying to bring what I was doing at home into my group classes for fear that, like, no one would be into it and I would lose my jobs.
Yeah.
And in literally the first time I met Mark Whitwell, in that lesson with him, I told him this. I told him that I was practicing sort of like what he was teaching, I think, at home, but I was teaching something else and I was conflicted. And he said quite directly to me, he said, if you don't teach what you're doing at home in your class, you're a fraud.
Ooh,
and I just went, whoa, it just landed so heavy on me. And I literally, like, I think 2 days later just decided that's it. And I just completely switched what I was doing. And like a lot of people weren't in it and into it and left. But a lot of new people started coming, you know. But to get back to your question, I say the story because I do think that some of what we're talking about, and I write about this in that post, is that if you embrace a sacrosantual perspective on yoga, it calls into question the other two perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
It's very subversive that way, and it's very hard to go back. And even when like you have a good teacher who's not really trying to like teach you a philosophy, like even if that teacher is not making that part of what's happening and it's really just focused on the forms and technique and that part of the practice, that viewpoint is still there. Even if it's not voiced, you will get totally different experiences and results. Like I bet I could take you through primary series in a way that did not feel at all like violent or torture. We might have to change some things about it, but I'll take you through every form, every pose in the primary series in a way that didn't feel hard or hurtful or felt like a loving embrace of your intimate. Like, it ultimately doesn't matter what forms you do.
Yeah. I guess that's the point I'm kind of getting at, is that these three sensibilities, it's not dictating the external form, in that you could have an Ashtanga practice that is transcendental or transformational or sacrosantual.
Absolutely. However, with one caveat. Okay? Because that is true if you're allowed to change it. Because it has to be allowed to change. Like, if you have to try to stick super strict to it and you're not allowed to, like, drop some things out because your knee's hurting you, or if you're not allowed to, like, make your feet a little bit wider apart because you have a wider hip set, and if you line your heel to your inner arch, it tweaks out your SI joint.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not allowed to make those little adjustments to suit your needs, and if you're not allowing for breath, and that's really the thing, because even when I was an Ashtanga practitioner, we always said it was about breath, and I did Ujjayi, but it was never about breath. It was always about moving through those forms in a somewhat swift manner, and then the breath was on top of that.
Yeah.
The breath is like a cushioning device, like cushioning the blows, you know, like.
Yeah.
So when you switch that, when you make breath first, and it's about breath being long and smooth, and then make your movements and body go to that, it has to get slower and smoother with breath. And sometimes that would mean changing the forms to allow for that. You have to be allowed to change the forms to allow for that intimate participation with your breath. And I bet I could do that with you. Me and you together, one-to-one, using, we could just pull out I know the primary series, you know it. We could go through it. We could slow it down. We could have your breath there. And we could do it in a way that would be sacrosantual. Absolutely. But it would take some doing, because the forms that we're using are coming out of a tradition that are not sacrosantual necessarily. And yet, Patabi Joyce and Mr. Iyengar, they both studied with Mr. Krishnamacharya, right?
Yeah.
But they have completely different systems.
Totally different, yeah.
So why is that? That's because Krishnamacharya taught different things to different people based on who they were and what they needed.
Exactly.
But they did not necessarily carry on that same tradition. They took what they learned and they created a method, and that method's very valuable. I don't want to knock the methods that they create. I've learned from them and I've benefited from them, and the planet's benefited from them. But those methods, they do not have that one essential element to them. Like even a Iyengar method, like when people say a Iyengar method adapts to individual needs, I don't know that that's true. Like they use props to modify poses, but you modify the poses to help someone because they can't accomplish the ideal. See?
Yeah.
Like instead of changing the alignment, you use a prop to compensate for their lack of ability with the alignment or something. Like it's like, I would say instead of using props, you just don't do that pose and you do some other pose. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that makes sense.
I'm saying that they're not always, a Iyengar method also, in my opinion, lacks this one essential element. And it's what Desikachar was really trying to put forth, but he was so humble, he never created any kind of like big school around him as they did. In fact, some people wanted to. Some people wanted to create a Vini Yoga Association of America or whatever.
Yeah.
And they had a big event, and Desikachar came and asked them not to do it. You know, basically said, please don't form an organization. It's not about a style, it's about people. You know? So in a way, it's great for yoga. Like if someone comes into the yoga center and they ask me, what kind of yoga do you do here? I cannot give them a one-word answer.
Yeah.
We have to have a whole conversation, which is great for yoga, but not for advertising, that's all.
Well, hopefully this interview will serve as a way that you can talk, that you can point to, and you can say, you want to know what kind of yoga I teach? Go check out this interview. Awesome.
Cool.
Well, Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been really interesting. You've got some fabulous things to say. I don't know if you've ever got it in your head to head down to New Zealand and do any teaching, but who knows?
It's on my butt list.
Okay.
It's on my butt list to get to New Zealand.
Okay, awesome.
So
well, if you
I'll certainly look you up.
Fantastic. If you need any help, I'm always here to make that happen. So thank you so much, and you have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you. Take it easy.